He did not pull the trigger. He did not plan the murder, but he was there. For country number 3, book number 3 of A Book from Every Country, we are reading Northern Ireland, Bernard MacLaverty's book, Cal. A book about guilt, fear, love, and what happened to ordinary people when they're trapped by major conflict. And before you read Cal, it is important to understand the world that Cal is set. Northern Ireland between 1960s and 1998. The book, of course, was written and published in 1983, so it talks mostly about that period. The book stays within that period. So to understand the whole conflict, we are not going to go too far back in history, but as any other historical event, you need to understand what happened previous to that. However, we are going to stay within the 1960s to 1998, the Troubles. You would be forgiven to think this is a religious conflict, because every major movies or books or magazines or newspapers or YouTube video that you watch will talk about Protestants versus Catholics. And even in the book, Cal, the author makes a reference to that. Cal himself, the main character, is a Catholic young boy or a Catholic young man. However, as you read more about it and you go deeper into the history of the conflict, you understand that it's a lot more about identity and a political conflict than a religious one. It just happened to separate Northern Ireland in these two groups, where one, majority Protestants, called the Loyalists, wanted Northern Ireland to stay or remain part of the United Kingdom, and the other group, the Republicans, majority Catholic, wanted Ireland to be free and one country, or be part of the Republic of Ireland. So, before that, or a little bit before that, the history talks about how the Catholics were not, or they didn't have the same rights as the Protestants in Northern Ireland. And as Ireland, or during the Irish Independence War, separates, a few of the counties up north don't and remain part of the United Kingdom. That's what formed Northern Ireland. However, a line on a map does not really explain what's going on in real life, and a lot of Protestants still live in the new Republic of Ireland, and a lot of Catholics still lived in Northern Ireland. However, they didn't have the same rights in Northern Ireland, in terms of education, in terms of housing, in terms of employment. The Catholics in Northern Ireland also started to revolt. You will not see that in the book necessarily. It doesn't really go that far. It doesn't really explain that. And we will talk more about the book in a second, but it is important to understand where the conflict started. A few paramilitary groups starts, majorly in the two sides, and over 3,500 people lost their lives. In 1998, however, a peace agreement was reached, which was called the Good Friday Agreement, and both sides agreed to start to have a ceasefire and start working towards peace. But before that, Cal, the book, is set in the 1970s, so the future is still very uncertain. Cal is a young, shy, and not involved in politics. He's not a revolutionary, he's not an activist. However, throughout the story, he is, however, present at the assassination of a Protestant police officer. At that point, the story starts because the conflict is happening. Violence mostly happened outside of the pages, and the story focusing on Cal and Cal's guilt for this event. And that gets even stronger as the book progresses, because Cal falls in love with a girl that he meets at a library. Her name is Marcella, And with time, he starts to realize and understand and learn that Marcella was married to the police officer that got killed. So, fear from getting caught, fear from being revealed, guilt for what he's done, guilt for not being able to tell the person that he loves about it. And as the story goes on, he does get into a relationship with Marcella, but every intimacy, every touch reminds him of what he has done, and it becomes not a moment of tenderness, a moment of love, it becomes a moment of angst. And that's how the book is written. The author does not make a claim of who is right, who is wrong, does not make a political or ideological statement or speech. He just focuses on how Carl lives with this guilt. In a few parts of the book, Carl is beaten up by a rival group, by a loyalist group. He's alone in the streets and the violence happens against him. He goes home and he does live with his father and some other people. And in this point is where you understand a little bit of Northern Ireland being a segregated country with a wall in the middle. And if you are caught in the wrong side of that wall, you were probably in danger. So to this day, if you look it up, and at least by the time the recording of this video, Belfast still have this wall, and at night the gate is closed, separating the two communities. Even though the violence dwindled, or at least was reduced, it's still there. The underlines is still there because of the differences between these two groups, and it was a 30-year war that happened. So people were affected by. Loved ones were killed, and generations carry that generational trauma. Kids don't go to different schools from their own, I mean. Protestants go to Protestant school, Catholics go to Catholic schools. There's not a lot of integration, and that's because of that history. When you start reading about it and you start understanding that, it doesn't feel like a United Kingdom, because you think about the United Kingdom as a first world country, a Western country. And this type of segregation shouldn't exist anymore, but it's still there. And it's all due to these many, many years of histories and the oppression and the violence that existed so recently in people's lives. But back to the book. Now that you understand that part, you understand why Carl is beaten up when he is caught by a loyalist group. Now he has to flee. And here's one note. When you think about identity, people in that period in history or in the book itself not even think about moving, because that's their life, that's their house, that's their home, that's their country, that's their identity. So again, it goes back to identity. The fact of fleeing from that violence or fleeing from that country doesn't really happen in the book, because it is not supposed to be like that. You're supposed to stay and fight. It is most likely seen as cowardice to abandon the country that you were from. And note, the Republicans don't want the British Empire to be controlling Northern Ireland. Therefore, they feel that the invaders, as they call, should be the ones to leave. But as I said, I'm mixing the history of the country with the book, because we need to understand why Carl didn't just pack up and leave. He does, however, hide, not only from the loyalists, from the opponents, but also from his group of people, because he didn't want to be part of that anymore. After being part of the assassination of a person, he no longer wanted to be involved with those people. However, it is a very hard situation, because after he's in, Even if he didn't want to, he's part of it. And he's not allowed to just disappear or to just give up or to just stop being part of that group. Therefore, he's in danger from both sides. Now he's by himself because he is in danger from his own side, from catching him as a deserter, because worse than a deserter is an informer, and they make that very clear on the book. And when you read the history of Ireland, it's still to this day, informants are a danger because they are betraying the trust of whichever group they are part of. So Call is not an informant, but he would be seen as a deserter because he left the cause. So as Call hides, he does hide in the house of Marcella, but he can't tell her that. He can't tell her who he is and what he was involved in. And they do have a relationship. And one of the things that I do like about the way that the author writes is that it's not focused on the conflict, but it shows you in painful details how the conflict affects the life of these people. So Call, as the main character, as you are following, you can feel his emotion, you can feel his angst, his guilt, his sorrows, and what he's going through. His mind is divided, his heart is divided, because not only he loves this girl, he feels the guilt for being part of her husband's demise. He's also fearful of being caught by the military, by the police, by whoever is out there, because now he is a deserter from one side, but he's also an enemy for the other. I tried to stay within the summary and not do any spoilers. And the reason is because this book is very short. It's a novella, so it's a small book. It's a very quick read. It's very easy to read, but you did need to understand the background behind the story. The end of this book is very interesting because the story doesn't really close or resolve. But remember, if this is based on a real thing, it shouldn't, because it is not resolved to this day. Going back to history in 1998, after the peace agreement was created, the only thing that it did was reduce the violence from both sides and start conversations about peace. But as I said, to this day, Northern Ireland is not at peace. And borders, hard borders, soft borders, still a conversation that is happening. What is wonderful about reading the book is that you can understand people that live in Northern Ireland, that are innocent people, that are not part of the conflicts, that never were. Some of them were not even born at that time, but they grew up receiving the signals from that history. They don't believe in forgetting about it because it's in their daily lives. Their ancestors, their parents, their siblings, they were part of those conflicts. So as I watched more about the conflicts, as I read more about the conflicts, it is really hard to find unbiased sources, because whichever side the people interviewed in the videos or in the books are, they will be writing about the wrongs committed against their group. And the sad part is there were wrongs committed by both, to both sides. And it makes you think. It's one of those books that as soon as you close the last page, you just keep thinking about it. Because the story of Call is just a normal young boy fall in love with young girl. But the underlining way that the book is written is fascinating because it shows you the emotions behind victims of that conflict. Because even though he was part of the assassination of the Protestant officer, he's also a victim of the circumstances. He's also a victim of that time and that place. It is very common for us to read a book and usually take sides because the book is written that way. There's very clear lines with villains and heroes. Our main characters are the heroes most of the time, and they have to fight against the villain, and for our benefit, the villain always loses at the end, so the hero can prevail, and the book can end in a happier manner. Call is not that book, because he's not a hero, but he's also not a villain. He's human, as many others in Northern Ireland were and are, that are still living through the segregation, that are still living into a divided country. And during Carl's time, the violence was a lot more prevalent. So he grew up with that violence. There are parts of the book that they are locking their doors and protecting everything in their houses and figuring out where they were going to hide and having a weapon as well, because they would shoot somebody that would try to invade their house. And you can feel that. You can feel the way that the author writes. You can feel that pressure, that fear. And that's what the book is focusing on. Guilt, fear, love, and what happened to people that get trapped in conflict. You're not going to find heroes. You're not going to find villains. Because it depends on which side of the aisle you are, or on which side of the conflict you are, or you think is right or wrong, you're going to see the conflict differently. But nobody will be able to deny that this book is a fantastic reading, and you should read, because it talks about emotions, and both sides have that. We all have that. And the emotion that you're going to feel is fear, guilt, and an amazing wonder for when is it going to end? When are we finally going to have peace, so people can live their lives without the violence, without the threat of violence? Go read Call. Go understand what happened in Northern Ireland, what's still happening, because it is a sad story, but it's part of the history, and you're going to learn a lot about it. I don't know what my next country is going to be, which one I'm going to be reading next, but I hope that I learned as much as I did reading this one. And I hope you enjoyed, or at least learned something by watching this video. Thank you very much.